So Praina, Anuradha, and I hope to frame this session as a conversation rather than a set of presentations. So I will just make a few points in response to Anu's wonderful presentation. I've never sounded that smart, by the way. And as Anu mentioned, as part of our preparations, she shared with us a dialogue that she mentioned that she co-edited with Ali Shine Hussein Osman, who's a Somalian-American activist and who grew up in a refugee camp in Kenya. The dialogue that they had unfolded around a set of objects and photographs. This is a mysterious artifact, and this is one among them. And in the dialogue, they attempted to describe the experience of living in and eventually leaving the camp that Ali Shine grew up in. In the back and forth between Ali Shine and Anu, the material and human conditions of a camp that have drifted materially and also humanly into permanence gain and lose their contours. The clarity that Ali Shine has from his practice of everyday life in the camp really contrasts with the camp's opacity to outside interpretation, let alone theorization, from both the UNHCR and those in charge of its management, and scholars and eager interlocutors such as Anuradha. So the first point I want to make briefly is one about misunderstanding, and it's one that I want to bring into focus by looking at this object that is a ration card that is given in the camp to family units as a tool of accounting for needs and to manage distribution of goods and food. It's a deliberately simple object and an abstract, qua neutral statement that is meant to easily function across cultures. So units understood as families are abstracted into this object that in turn can turn into food and goods. It is an object of correlation through which commensurability can be established against many lines of possible misunderstanding. However, we learned from Ali Shine that earlier versions of the card only accounted for 12 family members. This version accounts for 16, so that's what you see in the middle there. And so accounting only for 12 family members, larger groups would be attributed a second card, which in effect completely broke down the form and meaning of the card as a single object indexing a particular unit of reality, understood socially, biologically, in terms of the basic needs of food and shelter that this card is covering, but also economically and demographically, in this case, a family group described as neutrally as possible. So that card actually reveals much about the instability of meaning that Anu discussed. And what is more, it calls attention to instability of meaning as instability of form, as well as instability of form as instability of meaning. Let's see, I'll go back to the tomb. The second point I want to make is about material and spiritual word making, looking at the tomb that was photographed in the context or in the outskirts of the camp in Kenya. And I come to this point as much as a scholar of religion as I do as an art historian. The tomb is a reminder that the circulation of objects and perspective that we are talking about are taking place in multiple dimensions. And by that, I don't mean only time and space, but also along other cosmological, spiritual axes, the other dimensions of the world, dimensions that matter tremendously. So the powers through which worlds are made and remade, shaped and reshaped, are in some instances perceptible with our human senses, but in others are merely become apparent through their effects on the sensible world. So we don't see the forces, but we see their results very well. And some objects allows us to see through those dimensions very clearly, and the tomb is very much one of them, as it tells so eloquently how fates have been sealed and how faith and ritual intersect with, interrupt the secular, the administrative, and the geopolitical. And maybe I think that's what Anu's mean also by the scalar. A tomb, in particular such a modest and fragile one as the one on the screen, is so elusive and so, fragile. But at the same time, it is a definitive moment of word making. How can the camp be temporary if it includes a cemetery? And it also brings us back to the ration card and the instability of form and meaning that is within them. There is one less punch on that card, but the card is still the same, at least until the administration catches up. The third point I want to make is maybe too methodological, but I think nonetheless important. In response to Anu's reflection on the epistemological opening with which different approaches to circulation present us. Studies of the cross-cultural have spent decades thinking about and thinking through the roots, sources and derivations, mixings, novelty, change. And by bringing our attention to the scalar and linking it to ideas of space of correlation, Anu really asks us, how do we approach circulation and multiplication of perspective without using a temporal approach? Either because places such as the refugee camp pose real challenges to time as dynamic or time as stasis, or because, as in the Congo crosses, we have material and visual statements that are their own context, that document both themselves and the past and present context in which they participated. And what I mean by that is the Congo crosses are the only document that tell us about the pre-Christian, or almost the only document that tell us about the pre-Christian religious thought of the region, but they also are objects that have been made after change as occurred. And that's where a comment I made in a course of our conversation about being stubborn came from. And it's about not letting the shape of existing archives guide us too much in our reflection, and not to be afraid of the singular, the strange, the messy, the isolated. And I mean it quite literally, that one needs to make one's own archive and run because if you don't do that, you run the risk of ventriloquizing outside statements of power. And so that's a way to challenge institutions and challenge them on the one hand to do better, to be more inclusive, which is very much the context in which we're speaking today, and be more ambitious about their peripheries in expanding them without being imperial. How do you do that? I don't know. But also don't wait on the institutions either, and you can create your own archive. Thank you very much.